Hi class, welcome to Module 3. We will be investigating race and ethnicity in this chapter and looking at the issues related to the social problems around race. No surprise to you that there are a significant number of problems that exist across the world, but still in the United States today. Before I move forward, just a reminder, at this point you should have been thinking about your assignment 1, your poster, on a social problem, and please review the video related to that and what you need to move forward with. Let me know if you have any questions. Again, I'm recording these ahead of time so that you have the availability to work at your level. So by the next few modules, I will have seen some of your work and we'll have more information. And some of that information that I'll be giving you will come in the news page as well, as those will start to build as the course goes on. So this chapter explores race and ethnicity as a social problem in the United States, and its increasing diverse race and ethnicity exists in the United States today. We will be changing who is the majority as time goes forward, and we'll see that the growth has been significant in minority populations. Multiple reasons for this, including different beliefs as far as children being born, as well as immigration issues. So both of these tie in here. The growing population and the immigration issues. Now remember, immigration in this country, we often think of the high level of Hispanics that immigrate to this country. The highest immigration rates are actually Asians. So it's interesting as we look at this issue. So let me begin on the PowerPoint. The PowerPoint actually links you into a video. A Girl Like Me talks about that, and I've given you that link here as well. So hold for a minute. So how do we define race? Well, race is a social construct. That means that we make that up as the human race. There's nothing biological that comes into place here. And so we think about pieces that come into place. And when we look at genetics, especially DNA, the person with the nearest DNA match to you may have totally different skin color or eye characteristics. Now, we have tried for years to put people in categories and what races come into place because that's what scientists do. They often try to categorize people. They put them into groups. They put them in those shared genetic characteristics that come together. And so we see that we are building this social construct that defines what race is. Now, ethnic groups are different. Those are a group of people who are set off by some degree by their culture, their traits, their language, their religion, or diet. You know, that type of thing that comes into place. And so we know that people are German background because they speak that German language that comes into place, and we can see those cultures coming into place. We can see religion being part of it. Now it's interesting as we look at the Jewish faith because they consider themselves a race as well as a religious affiliation, and yet there's some significantly very different pieces as far as that biological approach within that. So social construct becomes an important piece for us to again define what we're looking at. And we're going to see that throughout the chapters as we move forward. So when we look at the people of the population of the United States, and we're looking in 2013, we can see the largest population are the people who consider themselves white alone. It's interesting as we measure what people are from. For each census, we have changed how we measure race and how we look at that. And in the past, you could only list one. And now today you can list more than one race. And so how many people have been lost in that process of that ethnic background being in place? So racial integration is tied to immigration, and that's the movement of people leaving their homes of origin or moving to another. It's tied to labor migration, and that's the population of people who move from one country to another for employment. We have a long history of people coming to this country for employment, such as the Chinese that were brought to build railroads, the Irish who came after devastation in their country and basically came over as slaves and indentured servants to pay off their debts. We have that migration piece of slavery that comes into place for labor migration. And then we have refugees. Those are people who are unable or unwilling to return to their country due to persecution, fear of persecution. The race and religion, nationality, they're fleeing corrupt countries. So we see refugees like the Syrian refugees we're facing right now as a big part of that issue. In the past, we had Vietnam refugees and Cambodia refugees that came to the country at a large level. So the patterns of race and ethnicity are important to consider as we start thinking about the social problems that come into place. We often have a belief, and here in sociology, we're asking you to use the sociological imagination. And in that, it makes us examine our own beliefs of when groups or values or behavior are right. That ethnocentric belief that what we have is correct. Now, this is pretty important when we look at other pieces of social problems that we'll be looking at throughout the course. But if we believe that our behaviors are the right ones, then someone from another ethnic or racial background who has other belief systems can fall into categories that are considered deviant. So it may be crime or it may be illness that we may consider it. Racism is the belief in inferiority, that one certain race or ethnic group is inferior, and therefore it is accompanied in this pattern of discrimination. And we can look at this easily, racism, when we think about the immigration of the Irish after the potato famine. They were considered inferior and they were locked into certain neighborhoods, which we call ghettos, which was not necessarily negative at all times, but today we consider it a very negative issue. Treated differently, not allowed into jobs. We could see that in place, that racism and this belief that people don't deserve equal has infected our country throughout the years. No stronger than that is the racism in this country towards Native Americans. You see, they aren't even that group that comes in from somewhere else, but they were believed to be inferior and treated different, to the point that we didn't even count them as wholly as one person when we were counting the number of people in the country. Acts like this increase by the individual discrimination that occurs, and that's the prejudiced actions against minority members by individuals. And individual discrimination is not just, as we start looking at this chapter, we have to consider some of the other chapters that follow. We'll see individual discrimination related to gender, as well as sexual orientation, as well as aging, as well as disabilities. And this discrimination comes into place where members of individuals may avoid contact or physical or verbally attack another minority in that process, or another section of the population. Institutional discrimination can be supported by government and is political and oftentimes tied together by social institutions. So the example here is clearly banks, political systems, not allowing certain people into certain neighborhoods. And we can see that that ties then to our next category is segregation. And that's the physical and social separation of ethnic and racial groups. And then we have exclusion, the practice of prohibiting or restricting entry of particular groups to society. We can easily see that right now as we are changing who is allowed to come into this country, how they're allowed, and how they can come into place. And then we have expel, where we expel people out and we remove the group by direct force, sending them out. And we have similar situations such as when we set up camps for people of certain ethnic background during the point of war. So, what is the issue that comes on here? As we start looking at the social perspectives, we're going to jump to those. The feminist perspective, the functionalist perspective really looks at the diverse culture entering that dominant culture, and that the goal is to preserve the stability of the dominant culture and blend that in, and to achieve stability. When we look at conflict in feminists, we look at the inequality of the system that is maintained by those trying to preserve that advantage of one population over another. Again, we can see the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, the class divisions, and how race falls into those categories. And so one of these big issues as we start to look at this is the intersection of multiple levels of problems, so that the feminist scholars look at the intersection of race and class and gender. So we had class last chapter, race this chapter, gender next module. The interactionist looks at how race is a social construct, how it's designed by the community around us that determines what race is, and how we're dropped in these categories, and how privilege exists, and how it may marginalize a whole community in fitting into the process. So what are the consequences of race and ethnic inequality? Significant disparaging differences of wealth and income. Race is so associated with class in the United States that it might not be direct discrimination, but it still really matters. Connolly talks about this at a high level when he looks at it, and in fact, I use his textbook and intro as he looks at how effective just being in that category can affect someone's life, and that there is a historic piece that comes into place that affects this population. It is interesting to denote in a video that I previously was able to show the class but no longer available, there is a gentleman talking at the fact that it takes 100 African American males to enter the Minneapolis system for one to graduate. That the power that comes in place is the whole discriminational issues that come along that system. So, pretty significant as we start to explore. There are significant differences for home ownership, and that is tied to previous histories that had come into place. And we saw such things as redlining, and we'll talk about that further when we look at urban and urban development and the effects on society. But minority groups had been denied similar access to certain home ownership as well as opportunities at universities. It is only recently that education has changed, and part of that is tied to some of the legislation that has come into place, like Brown versus the Board of Education, and the things that resulted. Now, what's interesting is even though segregation was ruled illegal, what we had was these neighborhoods changing. And so people who were able to leave their neighborhoods left that as integration was mandated. And so we saw something called white flight coming into place. So some particularly strong issues have affected schools. And so when we look at systems like here in Pennsylvania that are funded by local areas, that there is no mass sharing that everyone has. So those poorer communities of inner city are significantly have poorer schools in place, and we can see that directly affects those racial and ethnic differences. Now, while we're talking about that, we do have to talk, and we will do this in the chapter on education as well, about poor rural areas, which are oftentimes white populations, are directly affected as well with this poor system of funding. So education. Among all U.S. minority groups, Latinos have the lowest educational achievement. They are more likely than whites or blacks to attend the largest public high schools. They're in schools that are associated with lower student achievement and higher dropout rates. So it's very interesting as we look at this. And Hispanics are more likely to be in high schools with low instructional resources, textbooks that are more than 20 years old, 10 and 20 years old in place, and not replaced, poor buildings, as well as the fact that their teachers may be under more duress and even at times less qualified. So we can see this difference in achievement that comes into place. Significant differences also relate to health, and we know that this is a population that when we look at racial and ethnic minorities are less likely to have health care. Currently, under the Affordable Care Act, everyone's required health care, and what we see is the health care they're able to afford may cover less in that process. We currently have about 10% of the population without health care available, more likely to be ethnic and racial minorities. Then we face the immigration issues that we've alluded to in our first discussion, and I'll let you review those particular issues as we go forward. So as you're stepping back here, I do want you to look at the YouTube on A Girl Like Me and the effects of what race comes into place. This is a very short video, but also some of the solutions that have been put into place. A very short video, again, on affirmative action and how it's gone into place. Finally, as with all modules, you need to, when you finished your readings and you've gone through your process here, contribute to the discussion board. And with that, I look forward to your discussions on this particular topic, which is so vital to understand some of the social problems that we face. We'll be coming back to these issues of race throughout the other issues that we talk about, like drugs, like gender, how they impact. So each of these build on one another as you move forward. Let me know if you have questions. You have my office hours. Make sure you contact me concerning any needs you have in the class. Have a great day.